In March 2000, a small car wash in Irving, Texas, became the scene of a workplace massacre so cold-blooded it would shock the entire state. It was early morning and 6 employees were starting their day, laughing, unlocking doors and getting ready for customers. By the time it was over, 5 of them would never go home again. What unfolded inside Meatifying Car Wash wasn't a robbery gone wrong, it was a calculated execution. Victims were forced to the floor, shot once in the back of the head, and one was brutally slashed across the throat. The youngest killed was just 15 years old. The lone survivor would carry the scars and the pain for life. The man behind it? Robert Wayne Harris, a recently fired employee with a history of violence, an earlier murder on his record, and a grudge that turned deadly. In just minutes, he destroyed families, ripped apart a community, and set in motion a legal battle that would last more than a decade. It would end here, inside Texas's Huntsville unit, with a final meal, last words, and the needle. But to understand how Harris became one of Texas's most notorious death row inmates, and what he said before the lethal injection, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon because this is the kind of story that will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Robert Wayne Harris entered the world on February 28, 1972, in Dallas County, Texas, the second of several children in a home where stability was always in short supply. His childhood was a blur of rented apartments, hand-me-down clothes, and a revolving door of caretakers. His parents' relationship was fractured, sometimes together, often apart, and the constant moves meant Harris rarely stayed in the same school long enough to make lasting friends. Teachers remembered him as a quiet boy who kept to himself, but whose silence could quickly turn to outbursts when he felt mocked or cornered. Some classmates described him as the kid who sat in the back and didn't smile much. By the time he reached middle school, the gaps in his education were catching up with him. He struggled to read at grade level, his math skills were minimal, and his attendance record was a warning sign no one seemed able to fix. By his teens, Harris had drifted away from school entirely. Without a diploma, his job options were limited to the kind of work no one else wanted: scrubbing cars, hauling trash, or mopping floors for minimum wage. But even those opportunities didn't last. He had a habit of losing jobs as quickly as he found them, either for not showing up or for clashing with supervisors. It was during these years that his criminal record began to grow. At first, it was petty theft, taking things that didn't belong to him because, as he told friends, nobody would miss it. But soon the crimes escalated: misdemeanor assaults and eventually charges for indecent exposure, an offense that would later come back to haunt him. Police and probation reports painted a picture of a man who was not just impulsive, but deeply troubled. When a court-ordered evaluation measured Harris's IQ at 68, it placed him in the range of intellectual disability, a finding that might have qualified him for intervention or support. But in the world Harris moved in, that diagnosis was little more than a number on a page. It didn't stop him from drinking, from picking fights, or from making the kinds of decisions that pushed him further to society's edge. By the late 1990s, Robert Wayne Harris was living in Irving, Texas, working odd jobs, carrying old grudges, and nursing a growing sense of bitterness at the world around him. And soon that bitterness would turn deadly. On the night of November 29, 1999, the streets of Irving, Texas, were already cloaked in darkness when Robert Wayne Harris made a decision that would push him beyond the point of no return. His target was a 37-year-old woman named Sandra Scott, a familiar face in his orbit, someone he'd known well enough to trust, but also someone he now believed had crossed him. Sandra wasn't a stranger. She was a neighbor, a woman with an easy smile and a quick laugh, the kind of person who seemed to know everyone in her community. But to Harris on that night she was something else entirely, an enemy. In his mind, Sandra had stolen money from him. Whether that suspicion had any truth behind it didn't matter. What mattered was that Harris believed it, and once that seed was planted, it grew into rage. What happened next was fast, brutal, and terrifying. Harris abducted Sandra, forcing her into his control and taking her away from the familiarity of her surroundings. At some point during that abduction he made his decision final. He raised a gun, aimed it, and pulled the trigger. The shot ended her life instantly. There was no plea for mercy, no moment of hesitation. Later, when speaking about the murder, Harris showed no sign of remorse. He said plainly that he killed her because he thought she had stolen from him, as if that was explanation enough to justify execution. Sandra Scott's death could have been the moment when the justice system stepped in, when Harris's capacity for lethal violence was recognized and contained. But it wasn't. He walked away from that night without facing immediate consequences, moving on as though nothing had happened. And that was the most dangerous part, because killing Sandra didn't satisfy Robert Wayne Harris. It didn't make him stop. By the spring of 2000, Robert Wayne Harris had already crossed the line into murder, but it would be the loss of something far smaller, his job, that would set in motion one of the most shocking workplace killings in Texas history. Harris had been working at the Meaty Fine Car Wash in Irving, a modest business where regulars came for a quick shine and employees knew each other by name. But in early March, he was abruptly fired after a female customer accused him of masturbating in front of her. For Harris, it wasn't just a termination, it was humiliation, a public shaming that festered into anger, and then into something far more dangerous: revenge. In the early hours of March 20, 2000, the car wash sat quiet, its bays empty, the sun still low on the horizon. Harris drove there before opening time, armed and ready, his mind set on what he was about to do. When he saw manager Dennis Lee, 48, assistant manager Augustine Villasenor, 36, and cashier Rhoda Wheeler, 46, arriving for work, he wasted no time. Gun in hand, he forced all three into the cramped office, the air thick with fear. Once inside, Harris ordered Wheeler to open the safe. She complied, handing over the day's cash. But even with the money in hand, Harris's plan didn't end there. He made them lie face down on the floor, each one knowing in their gut what was coming but powerless to stop it. Without hesitation, Harris placed the gun at the back of each head and pulled the trigger. 1, 2, 3, and in a final act of brutality he slit Dennis Lee's throat. As the office fell silent, fate sent more victims his way. 3 other employees arrived for their shifts, unaware that a killer was inside. Benjamin Villasenor, 32, and Roberto Jimenez, just 15 years old, were forced into the lobby. Harris made them kneel. In cold execution style, he shot each one in the back of the head. The 6th employee, whose name would be forever linked to survival, was also shot but, against all odds, lived, though left with permanent disabilities that would alter every moment of their life. From the first shot to the last, less than 10 minutes had passed. In that span, Harris had ended 5 lives and shattered countless others. With roughly $4,000 in stolen cash, he left the scene, changing his clothes and checking into a nearby motel as if it had been just another day's work. 5 families, those of Dennis Lee, Augustine Villasenor, Rhoda Wheeler, Benjamin Villasenor, and Roberto Jimenez, were left to bury their dead, clutching photographs and memories, grappling with a truth no parent, sibling, or child should ever have to face. One survivor carried scars both seen and unseen, living proof of the violence that unfolded that morning. And as the days passed, one haunting question echoed over and over again: why? Why had Robert Wayne Harris felt that 5 executions and a handful of stolen bills could somehow settle his grievances? It was a question no one would ever truly answer. The investigation into the Meaty Fine Car Wash killings moved with a precision and speed rarely seen in cases of such brutality. Within hours of the massacre, Irving police had pieced together a suspect profile built on surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and the chilling testimony of the lone survivor. That trail led straight to Robert Wayne Harris, a man whose firing from the very same car wash just weeks earlier now seemed less like bad luck and more like a ticking time bomb that had finally gone off. When officers brought Harris in for questioning, the interview quickly shifted from suspicion to certainty. Harris didn't deny what he had done. In fact, he confessed. He told investigators how he had entered the car wash that morning, forced the employees to the ground, and executed them one by one. There was no hesitation in his words, no cracks in his story. He even admitted to the earlier killing of Sandra Scott, as though that murder were simply another item in a growing list of grievances and violent solutions. Forensic evidence backed every word. Ballistics testing confirmed that the bullets recovered from the victims matched Harris's own firearm. The safe's missing cash was traced directly to him. His clothing, recovered during the arrest, carried traces of gunshot residue and blood spatter patterns consistent with the crime scene. Every piece of evidence fit together like the grim gears of a machine, inescapable, undeniable, airtight. The Dallas County District Attorney's Office wasted no time. Harris was charged with capital murder for 2 of the victims, a strategic move under Texas law, which allows for a death sentence when multiple murders occur in a single criminal episode. But prosecutors weren't content with just the bare minimum. They brought in the remaining 3 victims, along with the chilling details of Sandra Scott's unsolved murder, as aggravating factors. This wasn't just about robbery. This was about a man with a pattern of killing, a man who believed his anger was a license to take life. In the courtroom, the evidence was overwhelming. Jurors listened as prosecutors methodically laid out the timeline, from the moment Harris arrived at the car wash to the instant the last bullet was fired. They saw crime scene photographs, carefully edited to shield the worst, but still powerful enough to leave an impression no juror could forget. They heard from the survivor, whose testimony painted in human detail the fear, the confusion, and the sheer terror of those last moments. The defense attempted to argue intellectual disability, pointing to Harris's IQ of 68 and a troubled upbringing. They suggested he lacked the mental capacity to fully understand the weight of his actions. But the prosecution countered with the cold, deliberate way Harris had planned and executed the killings, the steps he had taken to eliminate witnesses, and the calm with which he'd recounted his crimes afterward. In the end, the jury's decision came swiftly. After only a few hours of deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty of capital murder. And when the penalty phase began, their conclusion was just as quick. The sentence: death. For the families of Dennis Lee, Augustine Villasenor, Rhoda Wheeler, Benjamin Villasenor, Roberto Jimenez, and Sandra Scott, justice had been delivered in the courtroom. But it would take more than a decade of appeals, motions, and final petitions before that sentence was carried out inside the execution chamber at Huntsville Unit. What followed Robert Wayne Harris's conviction was not the swift end many might have expected, but rather the long, grinding process that defines the American death penalty system. A process where each side fights not just over guilt or innocence, but over the very boundaries of justice itself. For the next 12 years, Harris's defense attorneys launched appeal after appeal, each one an attempt to find a legal foothold that might keep him from the execution chamber. Central to their argument was Harris's intellectual disability, a documented IQ of 68, and the contention that under evolving standards of decency and landmark rulings like Atkins versus Virginia, the state of Texas should not be permitted to execute him. They painted a picture of a man whose life had been shaped by poverty, abuse, and neglect, a man whose mind had never fully developed the capacity for reasoning, impulse control, or moral judgment. But these were not the only claims raised. The defense also alleged racial bias in the jury selection process, arguing that black jurors had been systematically excluded, and they questioned the overall fairness of the trial, from the presentation of evidence to the handling of aggravating factors. Every argument was meticulously prepared, each legal motion a bid to slow the clock ticking toward death. The prosecution countered every point with equal determination, arguing that Harris's crimes were calculated, deliberate, and cold-blooded, proof, they said, that he understood exactly what he was doing. They pointed to the methodical way he carried out the executions at the car wash, the steps he took to silence witnesses, and his own matter-of-fact confession as evidence of premeditation, not diminished capacity. One by one the appeals fell. Texas appellate courts upheld the conviction and sentence. Federal courts refused to intervene. Even the United States Supreme Court, the final hope for many on death row, declined to hear his case. With each denial, the options narrowed until there was nowhere left to turn. By the summer of 2012, the path ahead was set in stone. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued its final ruling, and the state scheduled his execution for September 20, 2012. That date was more than a number. It was the end of every argument, the conclusion of every legal motion, the day when all remaining time would be measured not in years or months, but in hours and minutes. Inside the Huntsville Unit, where Texas carries out all of its executions, preparations began. For the victims' families, the wait for justice, 12 long years since the massacre, was finally nearing its end. For Robert Wayne Harris, the countdown to the death chamber had officially begun. On September 20, 2012, inside the walls of the Huntsville Unit, Robert Wayne Harris awoke to a day that would not end with another locked cell door, but with the closing of the green steel door of the Texas execution chamber. From the moment his feet touched the concrete floor that morning, the state's ritual for the condemned began to unfold in precise, deliberate steps. He met quietly with his spiritual advisor, the conversation hushed, the words meant only for the man who was hours from his own death. Friends he had chosen to be present for his execution were allowed brief phone calls, short exchanges marked not by panic, but by a strangely steady tone, as if Harris had accepted that no further appeal or legal maneuver could save him. Because Texas had long since abolished the tradition of granting a special last meal to death row inmates, Harris was served exactly what every other inmate in the unit ate that day. He ate without haste, neither savoring each bite as though it were precious nor rushing through it as though trying to be done. It was simply another prison meal, made different only by the knowledge that it would be his last. There was no public display of remorse, no statement of regret, no sign of fear. To the guards he was polite. To his friends he was calm. And to himself, it seemed he was already gone. At exactly 6 p.m., the green door to the Texas execution chamber opened, and Robert Wayne Harris stepped inside, escorted by guards whose expressions revealed no trace of emotion. He was led to the gurney, where leather straps secured his arms, legs, and chest. Beyond the thick glass partition, two groups of witnesses sat in silence. On one side, the friends Harris had chosen to spend his final moments with; on the other, the families of the people he had killed, their eyes fixed on the man whose actions had forever altered their lives. When asked for his final words, Harris turned toward his brother and the three friends who had come to see him off, deliberately avoiding the gaze of the victim's loved ones. In a steady voice he said, "I'm going home. I'm going home. Don't worry about me. I'll be all right. God bless and the Texas Rangers, Texas Rangers." The warden gave the signal, and the lethal drugs began their journey through the clear tubing. Harris's chest rose and fell a few more times, his voice now gone, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the chamber ceiling. At 6:43 p.m. he was pronounced dead. For the families watching from the other side of the glass, it was the official end of a 12-year wait for justice. For the state of Texas, it was the final act in the case of Robert Wayne Harris. But for those who had lost a father, a brother, a son, or a child, the closing of the chamber door did not, and could not, close the grief. The story of Robert Wayne Harris is one of wasted potential, senseless violence, and lives cut short. For the families of Dennis Lee, Augustine Villasenor, Rhoda Wheeler, Benjamin Villasenor, Roberto Jimenez, and Sandra Scott, the pain remains. We remember them not for the way they died but for the lives they lived. And we are reminded that justice, though served, can never bring back those lost. If this case gripped you, shocked you, or made you think about the thin line between an ordinary day and unthinkable tragedy, then we need your help to keep telling these stories. Your likes, comments, and shares not only help others discover these cases, but they also keep the memories of the victims alive. So take a moment, hit that like button, share this video with someone who follows true crime, and subscribe with the bell icon turned on. We have more real stories coming, cases of justice, loss, and the people forever changed in their wake. Because every story we tell here is more than a headline, it's someone's life. And together we make sure they're never forgotten.